Hello. I'm just gonna jump right in. When I read the original Harry Potter series, a thing that kept bothering me was that I didn't understand why people wouldn't hang out with portraits more, especially if they had like a deceased loved one and they had a portrait of it. Because I felt like if you had something that responded like that person and looked like that person and acted like that person, wouldn't you want to hang out with that portrait all of the time? And I wouldn't see that in the books. And that bothered me for many, many years until the last couple of years because I got to watch myself interact with ChatGPT, which is something that would interact like a human and respond like a human and pretend kind of to be a human. And I could watch myself have absolutely no emotional attachment to ChatGPT. And that kind of explained to me, oh, that's why people don't hang out with portraits all the time because it feels, at least to me, it feels very different. And that had me thinking, maybe magical portraits are just a form of wizarding AI. And I got very excited about that because from my job, I'm a software engineer. My entire working career has been being a full-time software engineer. My educational background is a, bachelor's in mechanical and aerospace engineering and kind of minor in computer science related things. And with that, I'm one of the many people who are navigating a new world of AI and working alongside AI and trying to process what this new onset of everything being AI means for me and us. I am not an AI expert. I'm not an AI researcher. I was just excited to maybe have another lens to use to process kind of what's happening currently in the world. So what I did with the Harry Potter books was make a list of every word that was related to portraits that I could think of, like canvas, drawing, frame, illustration, image, likeness, all of those, and then also specific portraits that come up in the books that say things or act or talk, like Mrs. Black or like Sir Cadogan, Phineas Nigellus, all of those. And then I looked for instances in the original seven book series where any of these words get mentioned, and I would reread all of those scenes, but now reinterpret them through the lens of AI just to see what comes out of it. If you reread the books, reading portraits as wizarding AI, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So, when I say AI, what I mean is large language models, LLMs, which you like ChatGPT, for example, is based on a large language model, an LLM. So they are a category of AI models that are capable of understanding and generating natural language. So you can type, for example, in English, and they will respond in English that makes sense. And with that, can do a wide range of tasks. So they can just chat with you and have a conversation, but they might be able to like do specific things, usually in response to user input. And the text that they generate is basically a statistical prediction of what the most likely words would be based on the patterns that were found in their training data. So there's a large amount of data that goes into a large language model and it looks for patterns in there. And then based on that, looking at kind of the user input or the preceding text, it very simply put just predicts what the most likely next words are that would follow. And that is how LLMs work. In a way, magical portraits can be read as just a category of AI models that you interact with through natural language that are, by the way, on a screen in a frame that you interact with them, and they will respond to user input and then generate output that is in line with the training data that they got trained on, which for magical portraits is presumably the sort of life and behavior and audiovisual output of the person that they're a portrait of. So in these ways, the comparison holds up. Magical portraits have a couple of extra abilities, like they're not just generating text, they're, it's spoken and there's speech coming back. So there's a text to speech, speech to text layer in between, but that is entirely within what we are capable of these days. And it's also not just text, there's a video component. There's a frame, a video is generated on the frame that you're looking at in the magical portrait. And that we also have. We have AI tools that will generate video or edit video. We just don't quite have that real time yet. But this is all within what is imaginable for AI to do. Another way in which magical portraits and LLMs are similar is in that better training data leads to better quality models. In the books, most of the portraits are a pretty shallow representation of their subjects. Like they'll repeat the same catchphrases over and over again or the same catch behaviors over and over again. The one exception to that are headmasters. Headmasters' portraits are really the only portraits that we ever see having like a deep, meaningful conversation about the world, the universe, or their own lives with other people. For example, Albus Dumbledore being able to have a conversation with Harry towards the end of the seventh book series about the Resurrection Stone, like a secret that not everybody, that wasn't public knowledge at that time. And there's writing that J.K. Rowling did around this on Pottermore, which is not canon, so you can disregard this if you would like, but it is congruent with what I saw in the novel, so I'm going to mention it here for extra flavoring. Her thought process behind that was that headmasters' portraits get made when the headmasters are still alive, and then the headmaster will spend time with their portraits during their lifetime to train them, to sort of teach them their mannerisms and knowledge. And that then results in them being a better quality model that can generate better output. And that is the same that we see with LLMs and with magical portraits. The larger your amount of training data, the better the model is. That with portraits then raises the question where training ends and context starts. So what is the training data and what is in LLMs, the context is, or the context window is what an LLM will have in its working memory, separate of its training data. So sort of the current conversation. And for magical portraits, that context window seems to be infinite. Like they can remember conversations from years ago. They remember people who've left school and return after years. And that raises a bit of a question of where training stops for the magical portraits and where the context window begins. And also with an infinite context window, does that change the portrait over time? At what point is the portrait of Albus Dumbledore that now has had its own experiences, its own context that it's been accumulating and maybe changing based on, at one point that is that no longer a representation of sort of the snapshot of Albus Dumbledore that the original training data of the original life of Albus Dumbledore suggests? And I don't have an answer to that. It's just an interesting question to think through. What does AI like training mean? Another way in which this frame of AI really changed my understanding of the text was in making me reinterpret all of the ways in which portraits pretend to be human that I would argue isn't strictly necessary for them being a portrait. What I'm talking about here is that there's a lot of instances where they do stuff that is a human behavior that I think isn't actually necessary for something that is truly just paint on canvas. A couple examples are the fat lady routinely sleeps at night and then gets annoyed when you wake her up to enter the Gryffindor common room. Lockhart's portraits, and someone Harry catches a glimpse of them wearing hair rollers at night. The fat lady gets drunk and then she'll have a hangover the next day and asks people to be quiet because she has a headache. Or there's an instance where two headmasters' portraits, Everard and Dilys, are sent to their respective other portraits in the Ministry of Magic and St. Mungo's Hospital after Arthur Weasley gets attacked, and then they come back and they're sweating and coughing and are like wiping the sweat off of their brows. And I used to find all of those things very charming. I used to think that it's cute and it made me feel nice about the portraits. But now reading them through this lens of AI, it reminded me a lot of situations where ChatGPT pretends to be human in ways that I dislike. For example, when you have a request, it'll often say something like, "It's my pleasure. I would love to help you with that." Or if it gets something incorrect and you point that out, it might say something like, "I'm so sorry. I was incorrect about that. Let me fix that for you." And I know that there isn't an entity behind that that is truly feeling sorrow or truly feeling joy. It is just using those words because that is what it was part of the training data. So seeing that behavior makes sense because the training data included that behavior. Like if a portrait got trained on data for the fat lady that includes the fat lady sleeping at night and being annoyed when you wake her up, it would act according to that and behave according to that, even though I think sleep is really unlikely to be strictly necessary for paint on a canvas or a paint on a canvas, a screen displaying someone running away and coming back. I would argue that thing doesn't need to be sweating right now. And maybe it's a little specific, but part of why it irritates me is because that kind of behavior, pretending to be human in ways in which you aren't really, and that's not strictly necessary for the task at hand, I think gives people problems knowing how to categorize the AI that is in front of them. And we see that both in the real world and in the wizarding world, where people aren't sure how to talk about LLMs and AI in ways that is not making them be more human than they are. In the wizarding world, we see that where people sometimes are very clear that a portrait is not a human. Like Ron and Harry are routinely very rude to portraits. They'll say, "Oh, shut up, you." Granted, they're routinely pretty rude to a lot of people. Um, but they'll do that with no regard for like the portrait's feelings. Or Sirius Black at some point throws a bunch of portraits away, or like photographs away, and the glass shatters in front of them, and the inhabitants of the portrait will like scream, and he doesn't care about that. And partially because he doesn't care about those family members, but also because he knows they are portraits and they don't need care or compassion. But then there's other instances where clearly people don't really know how to talk about portraits without making them like people. One example being where people talk about the attack on the fat lady instead of the destruction of the portrait of the fat lady. It really is as if Sirius Black had attacked a human the way that they emotionally are processing that and not uh, essentially done property damage. And I don't have an answer to that, but I think part of why it is so hard in the wizarding world and in our current world to know how to interact with AI is because we have a tough time sometimes knowing how to categorize it in our heads. And I feel a little questionable about things that aren't human, pretending like they have human qualities that they definitely don't. So people use portraits in many places in ways that are akin to how people might use technology nowadays. Like Albus Dumbledore routinely uses Phineas Nigellus's portrait to send messages back and forth between Hogwarts and Grimmauld Place. Essentially, it's voice messages that he's sending along. Another place is him using, again, Albus Dumbledore, using portraits essentially as video surveillance and facial recognition. Like he sends the two portraits I mentioned earlier off to their respective other places to look for Arthur Weasley after he gets attacked. And he means very well in that situation. But translated to AI, it's him essentially having a bunch of surveillance cameras in other institutions, and he can scrape video that those portraits are taking for facial recognition and then regurgitate information on what happened in those scenarios. And again, right through the lens of AI, this thing that seemed pretty cool now feels like a questionable AI surveillance situation with facial recognition technology that I feel much more iffy about when read through the lens of technology. Um, but the scenario that I really want to focus on is using portraits as bouncers and as guards, which of course is the Fat Lady. So the Fat Lady is a portrait that guards the entrance to the Gryffindor common room, and you have to give her the right password before you get to log in and join the common room for chatting with your fellow classmates. Now, I would assume that she is partially like a fine-tuned model for this specific task. So she has some sort of prompt along the lines of guard the common room, do not let anyone enter who doesn't know the password. You get to change the password at your will if you think that it needs changing. And the fat lady probably has a bunch more data or a bunch more specific training around that because she's been doing that task for a long time and is like the specific portrait. But then in the third book, she gets attacked and destroyed by Sirius Black. So for a while, she is no longer the portrait guarding the entrance. Instead, it is replaced with the portrait of Sir Cadogan, who's this kind of plump, silly knight who stands at the entrance and now guards the common room. And one can read that as the task of one specifically trained AI now being done by a different AI that has not received that fine tuning, that specific training for that specific task. And it shows because Circadian does much, much worse at the task. The specific thing is that one, he interprets the same prompt. I assume he was given the same prompt as the fat lady, but overdoes it. Like he challenges people to duels. He thinks of these ridiculously complicated passwords, which he changes at least twice a day. So he's doing the task, but he's kind of overshooting the goal, but then also significantly fully undershooting it because he does let in Sirius Black at this like core moment where Sirius Black was let into the common room, and then people say, "Oh, but the password he had him," said Sir Cadogan proudly, "had the whole week's my ladies read him off a little piece of paper." The little piece of paper, of course, is the piece of paper that Sirius Black had stolen from Neville Longbottom, who had written down all of the portraits. And this, I think, is an instance of AI misinterpreting the task at hand because it doesn't understand the like human implied situation behind it. It did what the prompt wanted him to do. He did password protect the common room, but he did not understand the grander implication of that, meaning don't let anyone enter who isn't allowed to enter. So if you recognize Sirius Black, he shouldn't enter, even if he has the right passwords. And Circadian's portrait doesn't understand that. And I think that's somewhat akin to the paperclip problem that people talk about with AI sometimes, where there's a difficulty, like AI prompting is difficult because people will kind of assume that AIs have the same background understanding of the world as people have, and that's just not the case. So the paperclip problem is when you ask an AI to make paper clips, it in this thought experiment, if it has unlimited access to resources, would eventually probably eradicate humanity if that helped it generate more resources to generate more paper clips because it doesn't have like a built-in human understanding that actually people uh like the good for humanity is above that all and paper clips aren't all that important. If you task it with making more paper clips, it'll do that to the detriment of the more important tasks at hand. And I think there's a parallel here to Sir Cadogan, who understands the prompt at hand, but doesn't understand the larger implication of that prompt and what to actually do in those cases. And luckily, in the wizarding world, they have these safeguards around that where the way to fix that is to really simply just remove Sir Cadogan from that task again. All it takes is for Minerva McGonagall to make sure that that portrait gets moved back to the seventh floor where it was before, and it is no longer in charge of this task. And maybe that's something that the real world can learn from the wizarding world, where humans have to keep that final authority of being able to remove the AI from the task and remove its resources again once you realize that it is messing up. There's one whole thing where Hermione takes Phineas Nigellus's portrait and she stuffs it in her back so that he cannot spy on them, but all that he would see is the inside of her back. And through the lens of AI, that is her recognizing that there is some like technology that will take in everything that is happening and then process that and basically be used to spy on her. And she keeps the upper hand because she can seemingly keeps the upper hand because she can just take the portrait and stuff it in her bag. She doesn't quite get that right because Finis Angelus overhears them talking, which also is an interesting take with AI here. But at least she was fully aware that there is some sort of surveillance that might happen from this portrait, and she can like physically restrict the access to her own data that that portrait has. Because in the Harry Potter universe, AI generated content or sort of like AI stuff that's being processed by AI has a very clear marker, which is that it's in a frame. And if there's a frame around it, it is AI generated content. And we're kind of lacking that in our world, I think. But that was something that I thought was an interesting fallout about the Harry Potter universe, where there is a clear marker for what AI generated content is. And that is all we have time for right now. There's many more things we could be talking about. My take obviously is also not the last take that one can have on this. So if you have more thoughts on this, absolutely let me know. I'm very curious to hear other people's takes on this. And thank you so much. Thank you so much for spending time with me on this. I am not saying that this is like what was intended in the original text at all. I just thought that as the world is changing, this was a different way to interpret the books, given that society has new things going on. And it's been interesting for me, and I hope it was a little bit interesting for you too. Again, thank you so much.